For 11 years, Ruth Calder kept a 1966 John Deere 4020 in the shed, while every neighbor traded up for a machine with a screen and a monthly payment. The county called the 4020 a museum piece, and Ruth stubborn to a fault. She'd mortgaged 200 acres for a new computer-controlled tractor, too, and when it threw a fault no dealer could clear, she did something nobody understood. She stopped paying on the new one and let the bank come take it. Then the supply chain broke, the worst farm equipment shortage since the Second World War, and one by one the new machines went dark in the fields. When the wheat was standing and going to ruin, hers was the one that would still start. The lowboy came up the gravel lane before sunrise on a Tuesday in March, carrying the new tractor like something on a float. Ruth heard the air brakes from the kitchen and set her coffee down. The driver winched the machine off the trailer and onto the yard, and it sat there in the cold light, cabbed and quiet, with a screen on the armrest and not one part you could reach without a password. She signed the paper on the hood of the delivery truck and walked back inside without starting it. The note was for 5 years, at a rate her father would have called robbery, and the land was what backed it. The 4020 watched from the shed, dust on the fenders, the same spot it had held since Walter Calder parked it there the year he died. The machine was a 1966 John Deere 4020 diesel with power shift, around 95 horsepower, closed center hydraulics, and every system mechanical and visible. There was no screen, no fault codes, and no part that needed a dealer to wake it up. Ruth had run it since she was 18. The farm had been run on it since before she was born. The county found out by lunch. At the Millbrook Diner, the table by the window had already heard, and Harlan Biggs was the one telling it, leaning back with his coffee and shaking his head like the whole thing proved him right. Ruth Calder finally got with the times, he said. A few of the men nodded. Walt Phelps laughed and figured she must have gotten tired of pumping grease into that old relic, and Harlan grinned and called the 4020 a nice planter for the front yard. They all had a good time with it. Nobody at that table had ever fixed a fuel injector with their own hands, and nobody at that table worried about a monthly payment they couldn't skip. Ruth wasn't at the diner that morning, but the story reached her the way stories do in a county where everybody's truck is recognizable at the feed store. A friend mentioned it offhand at the counter, not to be cruel, just to tell her what was being said. Ruth nodded, paid for her salt and her filters, and drove home. She didn't change a single thing about her day. She'd been underestimated before, and she'd be underestimated again. And she'd learned long ago that the right answer to a county that's laughing is to keep working and let the work do the talking when the time comes. Ruth heard about the jokes the way she heard about most things, second-hand and late, and she didn't answer them. She had her reasons for the new machine, and they weren't vanity. She'd added 80 acres the year before, rented ground from the Phelps family when they retired, and 95 horsepower wasn't enough to hold the planting window across 200 acres anymore. The new tractor would pull the bigger drill and hold the schedule. That was the whole calculation. The 4020 stayed because Walter's rule had never left her, and she wasn't about to sell the one thing on the place that didn't owe anybody money. She ran the new tractor hard the first week, and it did what the rep said it would. It held a line within an inch, the auto steer turning her at the headlands while she watched, and it pulled the bigger drill through ground the 4020 would have labored in. It was faster and cleaner, and there was no arguing with the work. What she couldn't get used to was the quiet of the cab and the screen between her and the engine, and the way the whole machine felt like it was renting itself back to her by the hour. The 4020 labored and shook and told you what it was doing through your hands and your feet. The new one glided and reported, and she drove it with the window down because the silence made her uneasy. She went out after dark and started the 4020 just to hear it run. It caught on the second turn of the key and settled into a low idle that shook the shed doors in their tracks, and she put her hand on the fender the way her father used to, and left it there a long minute. The new machine sat in the yard behind her, silent, already waiting on its first fault. She'd met the dealer rep at the county fair building in January, when the wind was bad and the heat lamps were doing more work than the coffee, and the parking lot was half empty. The rep was a younger man, polite, with a tablet full of numbers and a pitch he'd clearly given 100 times. AutoSteer would hold a line within an inch, and telemetry would send engine data to his phone and hers. A Tier 4 diesel met every emissions rule on the books, and the productivity figures made the 4020 look like a toy. Ruth listened and asked one question, which was what happened when a fault came up and she wanted to clear it herself. The rep smiled and told her the system would usually clear minor faults on its own, and for anything else, the dealer had remote access. She asked what happened if the dealer couldn't get to it. He swore that had never been a problem. She signed because the acreage needed the power, and the window didn't care about her feelings. The fine print ran 40 pages, and the part that mattered was buried on page 19, where it said the diagnostic software was proprietary and that certain emissions-related shutdowns could only be cleared by an authorized technician. Walter would have read that line and walked out. Ruth read it and signed anyway, because the calendar was closing, and the 4020 alone wasn't going to hold 200 acres. That was the trade. She knew what she was trading. One evening when she was 18, the year before Walter died, he walked her out to the shed after supper and made her name every system on the 4020 out loud. Fuel, air, compression, hydraulics, gears, and electrical, one after another. He made her trace each one with her hand and say where it could fail and what she'd do when it did. He was patient about it, and he wasn't in a hurry, and when they got to the end, he put his hand on the side of the engine and said the thing she never forgot. Everything on this tractor you can see, touch, and fix. No part of it needs permission to run. She didn't understand yet what he meant by permission because she was 18 and nothing she owned had ever asked her for a code. He died the next spring, and she spent the next 3 decades finding out. Walter had watched a neighbor lose 120 acres to a machinery note in the 1980s, a man named Kessler, who bought more tractor than his ground could carry and got caught by a bad year and an interest rate that climbed on him. Walter helped Kessler load his cattle the day the bank took them, and he came home and told Ruth, who was small then, that debt on a machine was debt on the land. Because the bank didn't want the machine. The bank wanted the land. The machine was just the handle they pulled. She remembered Kessler's name long after she forgot his face, and she remembered it the day she signed the note on the new tractor, because she signed it knowing exactly which handle she was giving them. The new tractor threw its first fault within the week. A sensor in the exhaust system flagged a reading that wasn't there, and the screen went red, and the engine derated to a crawl in the middle of the south field. Ruth called the number on the visor, and a technician she couldn't see cleared it from a town 2 hours away. The tractor bucked once, the screen went green, and she went back to planting. She sat in the cab afterward with the engine running, and thought about how the fix had come from a man in a building she couldn't see, through a signal she couldn't touch, on a machine she couldn't open. Walter's word for that came back to her, and the word was permission. She drove on and didn't say anything about it to anyone. The following spring, the cracks started showing in the county before they showed on her place. Harlan Biggs bought a newer machine than Ruth's, top of the line, and in the second week of May, it threw a fault in the exhaust system and wouldn't come out of D-rate. He called the dealer, and the dealer said 2 weeks on the part. 2 weeks turned into 9 days of the tractor sitting in the lot behind the shop, with the cab dark and a faint red light on the dash, and Harlan lost the first cutting of hay on his back 60. He told the story at the diner like it was bad luck, a one-off, the kind of thing that happens to other people and could never be a pattern. Ruth cut her first fields that same week with the 4020, slow and steady, the diesel note carrying across the bottomland in the evenings. She'd done the spring service herself in the shed, the way Walter taught her, with hydraulic fluid and filters, a fresh fuel filter, and an injector pump she'd sourced from Harkin's Salvage 2 counties east, where a man named Dale Harkin kept a row of parted-out 4020s behind his barn. The pump went in with wrenches and a manual and a whole Saturday. It cost her a fraction of what a single dealer service call would have run. The tractor ran the way it had run for 60 years, which was the way it ran when Walter bought it used in the 1970s. Dale Harkin was a man who understood Walter's rule without ever having met Walter, and he ran his salvage yard on the same principle. He kept the 4020s he parted out lined up behind his barn in a row of 6, each one bought dead at auction for less than the price of a single new hydraulic pump. He'd pull the pumps and the injectors and the synchro cones and sell them over the counter to men who still ran the old iron. And he told Ruth once that the day the new machine started failing, his row of dead 4020s was going to be worth more than the dealership across the road. She'd laughed at him that day. By the following spring, she wasn't laughing, and neither was he. The diner talk shifted that summer, though nobody admitted it was shifting. A couple of the Mackey brothers' machines had thrown codes, and Walt Phelps was on his 3rd waiting list for a hydraulic sensor. The phrase that started going around the table was that the new ones were touchy, said the way a man talks about a horse he doesn't fully trust. Harlan still brushed it off. He said the parts would come, they always did, and a man couldn't run a modern farm on iron his grandfather would have recognized. Ruth was at the counter the day he said it, and she drank her coffee and paid her tab and didn't say a word. The silence in that room was the kind that sits heavy, and everybody felt it, but nobody named it. She went home and greased the 4020 and checked the oil and thought about the 9 days Harlan's machine had sat dead. His tractor wasn't broken in any way his grandfather would have understood. It was in perfect mechanical shape, and it wouldn't run because a sensor had told a computer to stop it, and the computer had listened. That was the part the men at the diner couldn't quite say out loud, that the new machines could be 100% whole and still dead, and that the thing keeping them dead wasn't under the hood, but in a building in another town. The news broke in the fall, and it broke everywhere at once. The supply chain, which most of the county had always thought of as a thing that simply existed the way gravity existed, came apart in a season. Semiconductors, emissions sensors, hydraulic controllers, harnesses, all of it backordered with no date. And the farm press started using a phrase that got people's attention. They said it was the worst farm parts shortage the country had seen since the Second World War. Ruth read it in the paper at the feed store and folded it back to the page and took it to the counter. And the man behind the register just shook his head when she showed him the headline. The local dealer went from 2 weeks to no date to a sentence nobody had heard before, which was that they couldn't get it. A waiting list formed on a legal pad behind the parts counter, and it grew until the pad had to be started over on a fresh page. The manufacturers had a choice to make, and the papers said they were making it, whether to send the parts they had into the factories to build new machines to sell, or to send them into the field to keep the ones already broken running. They couldn't do both. They mostly chose the factories, because the new machines were where the money was, and the men with the broken ones waited. Ruth saw the list herself the week her new tractor threw its second fault. She'd driven to the dealer to ask about the sensor in person. The parts counter had a legal pad on the wall behind the register, and the pad had 40 names on it written in 2 hands, and the man at the counter didn't look up when she asked how long. He told her the sensor was on back order, with no ETA, and he said ETA like a word he'd learned recently and come to hate. 2 men were sitting in the waiting area by the door with their caps in their laps, and neither of them was there to pick anything up. They were there because sitting at the dealer felt less helpless than sitting at home, and Ruth understood the feeling well enough to leave without arguing. Field after field, the modern fleet started going quiet. Combines and tractors sat at the edges of rows with the cabs dark and the fault lights glowing faint red in the afternoons. And the county looked the way it looks in winter, except it was still fall. The machines weren't worn out. They were stopped by sensors and codes and parts that existed somewhere on a boat or in a warehouse, but not here, and not now. The dealer's lot filled up with dead iron, the way a hospital fills up in a bad year, and the technician who'd cleared Ruth's first fault by remote was now telling people he didn't know when and not telling them what. Ruth's new tractor threw its second fault in October, an emissions sensor, the same kind that was stranding machines all over the county. This time the dealer couldn't clear it. The engine derated to a crawl, and the screen went red and stayed red, and the part was on back order with no ETA, and the payment was still due on the 1st of the month. She sat in the cab a long while with the engine idling rough and the screen glowing, and then she shut it down and walked past it to the shed. She turned the key on the 4020, and it caught on the second try, the way it always did, and she drove it out into the failing light and headed for the field. Behind her, the new machine sat in the yard, paid for in part, perfectly whole, and completely dead. The bank called on a Thursday afternoon in November, and the woman on the line was polite about it, the way people are polite when they're reading from a screen. The note on the new tractor was 60 days behind. Ruth had the money in the account, and the banker could see that she had the money, which made the call feel like a test. Ruth asked how much was left on the principal. The woman told her. Ruth asked what the land was worth against it. She got quiet because that wasn't the question she was expecting, and the land was worth a great deal more than the tractor. Ruth said she wasn't going to send another payment on a machine that wouldn't run on a part nobody could find. She said it the way she said most things, plain and without raising her voice, and the woman on the line asked her if she was sure. Ruth told her she was sure, and she told her to come and get it, and she hung up the phone and stood on the porch and looked at the new tractor sitting in the yard where it had been sitting for 3 weeks. She had the money, and she chose not to send it. That was the part the county would never quite forgive, because it wasn't poverty that made her do it. It was arithmetic. She'd gone over it in the shed for 3 nights before the call, with the 4020's engine off and the new tractor sitting dark in the yard, running the numbers the way Walter had taught her to run them, on paper, in longhand, no feeling in it. The math was plain. The new tractor wouldn't run before the 1st of the month, and probably not before the 2nd month either, and the interest would keep ticking on a machine she couldn't use to earn the money to pay for it. She could keep current on the land note with what she had, and she could hold the harvest with the 4020 if she had to, but she couldn't do both of those things and also feed a dead tractor on a 5-year note. So she picked the 2 she could do and let the 3rd go, the way you cut a load in a bad year, and she slept fine after. The county heard immediately, the way counties do, and by morning the diner had the whole story, and Harlan Biggs was the one carrying it. "She's letting them take it," he said, and he said it like he was reporting a tragedy. The general opinion was that Ruth Calder had lost her mind, and the farm was next. The new tractor was the future. Everybody at that table had one or wanted one, and she had just handed hers back to the bank on purpose, which none of them could make sense of. Walt Phelps said it was the stupidest thing he'd seen in 40 years of farming. The men agreed it was bad. They agreed about it loudly, the way people agree about things when the agreement keeps them from having to think. The repossession came the next week, on the same kind of lowboy that had delivered it, and the driver was a different man, but the rig was the same. He winched the new tractor up onto the trailer, and the whole time the fault light glowed faint red on the dash, a small, steady eye that didn't blink. Ruth watched from the porch, hands in her pockets, and didn't wave. The driver nodded once on his way out, and she nodded back, and that was the whole of it. The machine that was supposed to carry the farm into the next era rolled down the lane and out of sight, dead on a trailer, still under warranty, still worth less than it was owed. She went inside and sat at the kitchen table, and she wasn't smug about any of it. That tractor had been a bet on the added acreage, and a piece of her pride, and watching it leave cost her something real. But Walter's rule was doing the math now in a way no banker could argue with, and the math was simple. A paid-for tractor that runs beats a financed one that doesn't. She had the 4020, she had the land, and she had kept current on the land note, so the acreage was never in play, and she'd planned it that way weeks ago in the shed with the engine running. The new machine was the only thing she let go, and she let it go on purpose. Walt Phelps told anybody who'd listen that she'd be sorry come harvest, with no new tractor and a shed full of antique iron. Ruth heard that one too, and she didn't argue with it. She kept the 4020 gassed and the shed in order and waited for the season to do the arguing for her, because the season always does the arguing in the end, whether you want it to or not. Harvest came in hard the next summer, the way it does when the crop is heavy and the weather window is short. The wheat came ripe across the county in the same 2 weeks. The modern fleet was still down on DEF sensors and ECU faults, on harnesses on backorder, on dealer software lockouts that nobody could clear without a part nobody could get. The papers were still calling it the worst shortage since the war, and by June it had stopped being news and started being weather. The kind of thing you just live inside. Field after field of grain stood ripe and going, and the silence where the diesel noise should have been was the loudest thing in the county. The weather was the other half of the pressure. It always is at harvest. The radio was calling rain by the weekend, and the men who couldn't cut were watching the sky the way they watched the parts counter, with the same helplessness and a tighter deadline. Wheat left standing past its window doesn't just lose yield, it loses grade, and grade is where the money is, and the money is what pays the notes on the machines that won't run. Every dead tractor in the county was a bet going bad by the hour, and the hour was being counted by the clouds. Ruth cut her own 200 acres with the 4020. It was slow against the new machine's pace, but it was moving when nothing else moved. She ran from first light to dark, the old diesel carrying across the bottomland in the evenings, and hers was the only engine sound in a county that used to have a dozen. The neighbors watched from their fences the first few days, and then they started walking over, and then they started driving over, and the walking and the driving had a different quality than the laughing had had a year before. They came up the lane the way people come when they need something, which is quietly. Harlan Biggs was among them, and he came with his hat in his hand, which was something Ruth had never seen him do in 30 years of knowing him. He didn't make a speech. He stood at the edge of the shed and asked if she could cut his back 80 before the rain, and he said it looking at the ground. Ruth said she could, and she said it without making him say any more than he already had, because she knew what it cost him to walk up that lane. She cut his 80 that week, and she cut the Phelps place the week after, and she cut the Mackey ground when the window was almost gone. She took a share of the crop where there was a crop to share, and she took trade where there was trade to make, and for some of the older men who had laughed the loudest at the diner, she took nothing at all and didn't talk about it. One of them was Jensen, 70 years old, who had told the loudest museum piece joke at the diner the winter before, and who now had 40 acres of wheat standing and a new combine that wouldn't clear its own fault code. He didn't come to the shed. He sent his grandson, a kid of 19, to ask if Ruth would cut the Jensen ground, and the kid asked it red in the face because he'd heard his grandfather laugh at her, and he knew she'd heard it too. Ruth told the kid to tell his grandfather she'd be there Thursday, and she cut Jensen's 40 on Thursday, and she didn't send a bill. And she never said a word about it to anyone. And Jensen never said a word about it to anyone either. And that was how that was settled between them. The stillness of those evenings stayed with her longer than the work did. The 4020 idled down at dusk, and the stubble went pale, and the county sat quiet in a way it had never been quiet at harvest, and hers was the only sound left in it. Her hands were too tired to feel greedy about any of it. She wasn't enjoying the position she was in. She was holding the line for people who had laughed at her for 11 years, and the holding was the part that cost her, not the cutting. The 4020 ran every field the county needed run, one pass at a time. It had 95 horsepower and no screen, while the new machines sat dark at the field edges, like a row of monuments to a season nobody would forget. By the end of the third week, the whole county's harvest was riding on one old tractor and one woman who had never asked permission to fix a thing in her life. It was in the fourth week that the 4020 failed, the way everything fails eventually when it's carrying more than its share. Ruth was cutting the last of the Mackey ground, the farthest field from the shed, when the hydraulic pressure dropped and the power shift ground going into gear. She shut it down in the furrow. She climbed off and looked at the back of the machine and knew before she opened it what she was going to find. A hard line cracked and the transmission low, and a synchro cone going in the range box. The kind of failure that would have ended a modern machine's season on the spot. She didn't call anyone. She hooked the 4020 to the farm truck with a chain and towed it back to the shed, 2 miles down the county road at walking speed, the diesel dead and the iron rolling behind her like a slow parade. In the shed, she drained the hydraulic system into a pan and found the crack in the hard line and bent a replacement from stock steel she kept on the rack, fitting it by hand until it seated. The synchro cone she pulled from the salvage 4020 she'd bought from Dale Harkin 3 years before for exactly this. A whole second machine parted out in the back bay of the shed against a day she'd always known would come. The range box on a power shift isn't a quick job. She worked it alone for 2 days, with the shop light on a cord and the manual propped open on the fender, the pages greased to the ones she needed. She pulled the cone with the drift and the hammer the way Walter had shown her when she was young, checked the dogs for wear, and cleaned the magnet on the drain plug, and read the metal in it like a man reads a weather forecast. Nothing on the bench that day cost her more than the steel and the time, and nothing on the bench that day required a phone call or a password or a part on a boat. She seated the cone, buttoned the range box, filled the hydraulic system from the drum in the corner, and bled the line she'd bent until it held. The 4020 started on the second turn of the key. 2 days of wrenches and a manual and her own hands, and it rolled back out to the Mackey field. The county extension agent had come out that week to advise the men on the modern fleet, a younger man named Paul Wist with a clipboard and a lot of sympathy and not many answers. He'd been walking the dead machines at the field edges, and he wandered into Ruth's shed while she was finishing the repair, and he stood in the door and watched her seat the cone. He asked her a few questions, and then he stepped back from the open transmission, the way a man steps back from something he's only read about. And he said it plain. The 4020 had no electronic control unit, no emissions system, no part that required a dealer to pair or to clear, and that was why it was running when nothing else was. Ruth wiped her hands on a rag and told him she knew. She let him say the rest of it because she figured the county needed to hear it from somebody with a clipboard, even though she'd known it since she was 18 in the shed with her father. The 4020 finished the Mackey field that evening. It finished every other field the county had left, and it did it on a repaired hydraulic line and a salvage synchro cone and the kind of mechanical work that doesn't wait on a part number or a password. The season closed with Ruth's hands black with grease and the bottom land cut clean to the stubble, and not one new machine in the county turned a wheel during the last 3 weeks of it. The harvest that fed the county and paid its notes came off the ground on the back of a 1966 tractor that had been laughed at for 11 years and had never once asked anyone for permission to run. The last field was the Phelps place, cut on a Friday evening with the light going gold over the stubble, and Ruth idled the 4020 down at the fence line and sat on the fender a long while before she drove it back to the shed. The county was fed and paid because of one machine and one woman, and the quiet of that was different from the quiet of the year before. The diner was different too. Holland Biggs sat at the table by the window, and he didn't tell any stories. And the men who had laughed about the 4020 being a planter didn't laugh. The room had the feel of a place where something had been understood that couldn't be put back into the box. The reversal came small and late, the way reversals do. Harlan walked over to the counter where Ruth was paying her tab and asked her, almost awkward, where she'd found the salvage 4020. She told him about Dale Harkin and the row of parted-out machines behind the barn, and Harlan listened like a man taking notes. A couple of the other men started asking about older iron that week. Pre-emissions, pre-computer, the kind of machine you could open with a wrench and a manual. The dealer's lot was still full of dead new machines, waiting on parts that the papers said might not come for months, and the waiting list at the parts counter had grown to a second legal pad. Harlan bought a 1970s diesel from Dale Harkin before the month was out, a machine older than he was, and he drove it home down the county road, looking like a man who had learned something he wished he'd learned cheaper. He didn't tell Ruth he'd bought it. She saw it go past the lane from the shed anyway, and she watched it until it was out of sight. And she didn't smile where anyone could see her. The dealer across the road from Harkin's still had a lot full of dead new iron and a second legal pad full of names, and Harkin's row of parted-out 402s was down to 2 by August, because the county had figured out what held and what didn't, and it had figured it out the hard way. Ruth said the line at the counter the day Harlan asked, and she said it the way Walter had said it to her in the shed when she was 18. Everything on this tractor you can see, touch, and fix. No part of it needs permission to run. She said it without raising her voice and without explaining it, and the room got quiet in the way that rooms get quiet when a sentence lands that everybody already half knew. Only now the whole county understood what Walter had meant, because they'd spent a season living inside the opposite of it, waiting on permission that never came from machines they couldn't open and parts they couldn't find. The accounting came in the months after, and it was the kind of accounting that proved the story. The bank resold the repossessed new tractor, still bricked, the fault light still faintly red on the dash, and it went at a heavy loss because nobody wanted to buy a machine that couldn't run on a part that couldn't be found. Ruth's land had been the collateral on the note, and the land was the thing people kept telling her she'd been crazy to risk, but she'd kept current on the land note the whole time and let only the tractor go. She'd planned it that way in the shed with the engine running, weeks before the bank called. The acreage never moved. The bank took the loss on the machine, and Ruth kept the ground and the 4020 and the season. The 4020, paid for decades ago, was worth more that winter than it had been in a generation. The price had climbed hard. Running, pre-emissions, pre-computer 402s were what people wanted when the new ones couldn't be trusted to start, and a working one had gone past what a new one cost a few years before. Dale Harkin told her he could sell hers tomorrow for several times what she'd paid for the salvage one, to a line of buyers, and he wasn't joking. Ruth said she'd think about it, which was her way of saying no, because she wasn't going to sell the one thing on the place that had held the county together to a stranger who hadn't been there when it was laughed at. She said the lesson once, at the end, after the story had earned it, the way Walter would have said it. The land was the part the county had said she was crazy to risk, and the land was the part she'd been most careful with, because Walter had taught her that land is the one thing you don't give the bank a handle on. She'd kept the land note current the whole time the tractor note went dark, and she'd done it on purpose, because a tractor is a tool, and a tool can be replaced, but ground in a family for 3 generations can't be bought back at the price it was lost. The new tractor had been a bet on more acres, and the bet had gone bad on a supply chain she couldn't see, and she'd cut the loss where it was instead of letting it climb into the dirt she farmed. That was the whole of her arithmetic. By the following winter, it was the arithmetic the rest of the county was doing too, a year too late and a lesson more expensive than hers. The most useful machine on a farm isn't the newest one. It's the one that runs when nothing else does. And the one that runs when nothing else does is almost always the one you can fix with your own hands and owe no one for. She said it in the shed, with her hand on the fender and the 4020 cooling behind her. And the new machines were still dark across the county, and the world was moving toward iron you couldn't open and codes you couldn't clear. And she wasn't. Ruth parked the 4020 and pulled the shed door shut. Across the county, the new machines were still dark and waiting on parts that might never come, and the men who'd laughed were still paying on machines that wouldn't start. Subscribe to Rust and Roots if you believe the best machine isn't always the newest one, and come back next week for the next one.